Since the sun seems to be in my favor, I thought I'd do one more before concluding for the day. And I'm going to speak a little bit more in detail. I would say this would be a bit more advanced discussion of the idea of self-witnessing and self-non-witnessing and presences and absences. A very interesting idea that comes up in the area of phenomenology, which is one of the distinguishing features of phenomenological thought, was its concern with absences. And that's a quite long, detailed unwinding, unraveling. And the idea that you may have different types of absences. You may have pregnant absences, you may have vacuous absences, you may have banal absences, you may have tense absences, you may have relaxed absences. You could go into many different forms of absences. And that brings me a bit to the idea of association and dissociation, which will be spoken to quite a bit. This is something that the field has a great deal of interest in, investment in, talking about association and dissociation. So I would propose that there are many ways. There's a great palette of ways that one can be associated and dissociated. And once again, we run into that definitional constipation of the idea of, well, either you're associated or you're dissociated. And are you F2 position? Are you F3 position? Are you F4 position somehow? Some universal God's eye view looking at you from some great other perspective. And I think when you say something is associated, you're associated with the thing. It's when you say this thing is personal to me. The associated position is where you feel it personally. You are personally engaged. You have a sense of personal investment. You have a sense of personal gain and loss. And a dissociated position, you might say, is an impersonal position, somewhat impersonal position, where it may be happening, it may be occurring, but it's not something that is of huge personal import or huge personal significance. It's something that you get perceived more as data. Is there objectivity in the world? No, I don't think so. One of the great, I think the great errors, well, maybe not an error, but one of the great confusions that is rife in NLP at the moment is the idea that one imposing content. All right, what is that an example of? Asking, is that imposing content or not? Should you not impose content? Can you not impose content? And I would propose that it is the way the brain operates. If one is familiar with the theories of how the brain operates, there's no way you cannot impose content, although you may try to somehow buffer or distance yourself somehow from that content. The brain is a content-imposing organ, and I don't think it's fair to call it a computer. It is some unique organ. It is the most complex known structure in the entire universe. There is nothing in this universe that we have any knowledge of that rivals the human brain in its complexity. And so therefore I think to try to reduce it to some other thing or force or metaphysical construct or whatever is inadequate. We have this idea of adequacy. Are ideas adequate? Are abstractions adequate for their subject? Do they adequately, or can they adequately contain them? Can they adequately represent? It's almost like a good attorney. Is that attorney capable of representing that abstraction? And is that abstraction capable of representing that concreteness? So adequacy is very important. Are our ideas adequate? Can they adequately represent? Can they adequately give image to? Can they adequately give rise in the mind of another person as to the phenomenon under observation? Or do they leave an inadequate impression, something that's got too many blanks to fill in? So one can be adequately adequately associated. One can be adequately dissociated. And if it's some, you may say it's some very, very strange, bizarre, traumatic experience, is one able to adequately dissociate from that to the point where it's not impinging on your organic self, your autonomic nervous system. And there may be another way of looking at it, another way of representing that idea. If you're associated with something, you are very aware that your autonomic nervous system is engaged. And in a dissociated state, your autonomic nervous system tends to be disengaged, and things are simply being represented, hopefully adequately represented, say, with one perceptual system, which may be isolated. Say, it is only being represented in the visual system, or only consciously represented in the visual system, or some subset of the visual system. So we spoke about, well, what is an adequate F2? What is an adequate feedback loop? How much does that have to kind of get you where you live? Where does that really get done into your business? That feedback loop, does that adequately provide you with a degree of self-awareness that you feel it in your autonomic nervous system as something that you are motivated to do something about? And that's one of the good ideas about really associating with certain things. The association and motivation are very, very closely related. That's something I would imagine Tony Robbins would like to say. Association and motivation and association. So when you have an adequate feedback loop, it is adequately associating with, it is adequately connecting with the autonomic nervous system in a way that permits you to engage yourself in a process of self-evaluation, of self-motivation, of self-discovery, and of self-change, of self-transformation. In order to engage those processes, there has to be adequate association. And at the same time, you would like to have the capacity to adequately, appropriately dissociate. So you might be able to associate to a degree, then dissociate to a degree. So you really take it on and you really feel it. And then maybe you just set it out there in a movie, or you set it out there in some kind of representation that you can evaluate somewhat objectively. So I think that when we have this self-discovery process, there is a combination and a set of choices and availability of being able to move from associated to dissociated, dissociated to associated, and there's a cycle of association and dissociation, or a rich, complex set of depictions of oneself from multiple perceptual positions, multiple degrees of association and dissociation, multiple levels of abstraction, from the very concrete to the very abstract. So you get say a full, sort of the full hologram of where you might be at, and you might get a full hologram as you develop it of where you might like to get to, and what the cost of that journey is, and what the steps, and what are the dependencies, the critical path, as they say, the critical path method. What is the critical path if you wish to engage in that journey? And what is adequate? What are adequate steps? And what are adequate preparations and adequate provisions to make that step, which will involve moving through a cycle, a constant rich cycle of association and dissociation, evaluation, experimentation, discovery, stepping back, seeing the whole thing, zeroing in on specific goals and specific interests, moving toward those, and making adjustments as you go. And again, that is coming from, I think, a philosophical perspective. Is there a science of self-transformation? Maybe they'd like to convince you of that, to charge you a lot of money in a business school or something. But I think it really has to be taken on more as a philosophical project with a certain very strong sense of adequate, and I won't say the scientific method, but an adequate degree of scientific and philosophical rigor, or removal of fantasies, and a removal of superstitions, and a removal of magical thinking, and a very strong degree of realism and purpose. Okay, done.